One of the things, no scratch that, the thing that made the Millennium Falcon arc of Berserk so interesting is the fact that an apostle, who was supposed to be a slave to the God Hand, was taking up arms against them. Emperor Ganishka's invasion of Midland was as swift and brutal as it was short-lived. The demonic thundercloud rolled into the west thinking he'd use his usual playbook and come out with a dub, but he was dead wrong in assuming that. Instead, he got cooked up and turned into a goddamn tree. But what if he didn't resist his inherent nature? What if he gave into it and joined up with Griffith instead of fighting him? What would that world look like? We'll be exploring that exact prospect in this video, so make sure you stick around till the end. Why Ganishka wanted to fight Griffith in the first place? The reason behind Ganishka wanting to take on his natural master is pretty much the same reason that he became an apostle in the first place: his incredible ego. Demons in Berserk aren't born from happenstance. There's a method to the madness, and that method is highly dependent on the ego of the person chosen to become a demon. If that person has the capacity to set their ego aside and accept their life for what it was, they would most likely not turn into apostles at all. But the stronger a person's ego is in their human lives, the more it spills over into their apostle lives. And Emperor Ganishka is one of the most egoistic characters in all of Berserk. The guy was born crown prince of the greatest empire in the East, and his entire life was dedicated to ruling and conquering. Most apostles are regular people who possess the egos of a demon, and are then blessed with the power to match it. On rare occasions, you'll find apostles whose egos are so strong they surpass the base limitations of their apostle anatomies and become demonic generals. Zod's main goal was to find the absolute strongest being to fight. He received a body to match that purpose and became one of the strongest apostles to appear in the last 300 years. Grunbeld wanted the glory of dying on the battlefield on his terms, so he got the body of a dragon whose body is nigh indestructible. Locus wanted to serve a man whose vision for the world was perfect, so he became a metallic centaur that now helps said man bring said vision to life. But none of these apostles had ever been rulers or kings, and Ganishka had been living the tumultuous lifestyle of an emperor since he was just 18 years old. By the time his reincarnation occurred, he was so deeply entrenched within his global conquest that it continued to be his greatest ambition post-reincarnation as well. Do as thou wilt, indeed. Ego takes on a different shade when it comes to rulers. Many express it through arrogance, others through facetiousness, but Ganishka expressed his ego by utterly crushing any enemies dumb enough to stand in his way. Thanks to his immense desire to replicate Geiseric's conquest, the Dread Emperor was blessed with an apostle form that no apostle could even touch. On the flip side, Ganishka could burn multiple apostles to death with his ability to shoot lightning bolts at his targets. He could control the manifestation of his release state to the point where he used it for surveillance, espionage, covert invasions, and a bunch of other things. And, worst of all, he used his newfound status as a demon to create more demons, which he then loosed upon the world to speed up his campaign. It wasn't as though Ganishka was unaware of Griffith's arrival as the Falcon of Light. In chapter 231, we see him acknowledging the Falcon as the master of us reincarnates. He knew that his appearance meant that the world was about to be transfigured, and surely, clinging to him was the ultimate purpose of an apostle. After all, to his kind, the God Hand were deities. Their very presence felt like an embrace from God to these people, but Ganishka felt that every apostle serving under Griffith was a knave. He was the great emperor of the Kushan Empire. He controlled the vastest territory in the world at the time. He was the one who takes, never the one who is taken from. And though it might have been blood-stained and corrupt, this world was his. This is why he opposes the God Hand, and what we meant when we said his ego was the reason he wanted to defy Griffith. Ganishka's desire for global conquest was so immense that he was ready to defile God himself if it came down to it, but no matter how much he tried to do that, it just never came to be. In fact, he ended up becoming an instrument for the God Hand's grand plans, which is exactly what he wanted to avoid in the first place. What happened during their war? Femto versus Shiva. The Kushan Empire's invasion of Midland was flourishing in its initial stages. With the king dead and his heir being a recluse, there was no one who could organize Midland's defenses fast enough to combat the Kushan. They steamrolled their way through the kingdom, and Ganishka occupied its capital city, Wyndham, turning it into a macabre altar for his accomplishments. Corpses adorned every corner of the city, from its churches to its gargoyles lining its parapets. Demonic beasts prowled its streets, hidden by the thick fog that the Dread Emperor blanketed all of Wyndham with. Charlotte became his prisoner. Every knightly order in Midland fled from the capital, and he had free reign to do as he pleased. That is one thing that Ganishka took seriously when it came to heeding the God Hand's words. He might not have accepted subordination, but he definitely had no problems with doing as he willed. The Dread Emperor pressed his advantage over the Western Hemisphere and went beyond Midland territory by the time Griffith was incarnated. He was making moves to capture the holy city of Vertanis when his enemies started the counterattack. The Falcon began by liberating border towns and holdfasts from their Kushan enslavers and worked his way inward. He sent his war demons to Wyndham on a surprise raid as a distraction so he could rescue Princess Charlotte. He then sent them over to Vertanis on the same night Ganishka made his move on the city to take care of his demonic troops before they dealt with his main army. And while that assault didn't exactly unfold as planned, the end result was in Griffith's favor. Thanks to a twist of fate and an assist from the Black Swordsman, his war demons were able to neutralize the Dread Emperor's fog form and force him to get rid of swaths of his Pishacha and Daka. The reason Ganishka gave the order to commit suicide before the sun came up was simple. He didn't want anyone figuring out the true secret to his military success. When the Holy See Alliance took stock of their losses the next morning, they were dumbfounded, because all they saw were the dead bodies of humans and animals where, just last night, they were dealing with enchanted beasts. That feeling was replaced with despair when they saw the Kushan main army descend upon Vertanis like a swarm of locusts straight from the Bible. 200,000 armed and armored soldiers were about to stampede through the city walls, and in the beginning, the Kushan assault was going well. But then, the Band of the Falcon showed up and turned the tide of the battle so sharply that the people with the clear numbers advantage ended up retreating. The reason for that was simple. Griffith had just shown Ganishka his place. The Dread Emperor knowingly resisted his instincts as an apostle, and when he wasn't anywhere near Griffith, that worked out just fine for him. However, the presence of a God Hand member isn't something any apostle can resist for long, because when they're near their gods, their hearts overflow with an instinctual sense of worship. Ganishka was trembling before Griffith even opened his mouth. When he did finally speak, the Emperor knew he was screwed, because a single audible sentence was about to drive him crazy. He tried using his released form on the Falcon, but the latter simply used his spatial powers to break Ganishka's mobile castle and scatter his fog to the wind. It was the Dread Emperor's turn to experience despair, because that exchange made him realize no matter how many humans or demonic troops he threw at Griffith's army, nothing could match up to it. He had to find a way to transcend his current level, and to him, that could mean only one thing: a second reincarnation. Ganishka decided to immerse himself within the man-made behelit that his wizard general Daiba had created because he knew that it was his only shot at gaining more abyssal power. Ganishka emerged from that contraption far stronger than he ever was before, but that much astral energy flowing through his veins sort of broke his mind. As an entity, he was comparable to the Indian god of destruction, Shiva. To know more about why this is the case, we suggest you check out our video on his Shiva form, which is available on our channel. But to sum it up in one sentence, he turned into Berserk Cthulhu, but instead of being connected to water, Ganishka spit fire from his many, many mouths. If he'd retained even a sliver of his sanity, perhaps this form would have proven difficult for Griffith to deal with. However, turns out that Ganishka's ascendance was part of Causality's plan. With that much astral energy running through him, Ganishka was the prime candidate for changing the world. All that was missing was a spatial portal to link him to the Abyss, which showed up rather conveniently in chapter 303. Griffith, who was in his released form as Femto, manipulated an attack from Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation and used it to trigger a global interstice. This situation was destined to occur because he quoted Causality right before he did it, and it was also the end of Emperor Ganishka's life and ambition. In the end, he was nothing more than the tool he so desperately desired to not be. But what if he didn't resist Griffith's rule? What would that world look like? Let's find out. How would things have changed if Ganishka had joined Griffith instead? Let's assume that Emperor Ganishka, the leader of the vastest territory in the world, was somehow able to humble himself and admit that he couldn't take on a God Hand member well before he invaded Midland. We know it's unlikely, but let's assume that anyway. It would have fast-tracked Griffith's dream at an unprecedented pace because they'd have two kingdoms just waiting for him to take control of them. Every apostle in the world knew that their master was going to enter the physical domain soon after his birth. They saw it in their dreams, oracles spoke about it, or if they'd been transformed recently, the God Hand themselves would direct them to seek out Griffith post-conviction arc. This gives Ganishka enough time between his reincarnation and the incarnation ceremony to make a decision about his goals. If he chose to put aside his ego and accept his natural inferiority to Griffith, he'd have also likely submitted not just himself, but his entire empire to Griffith's rule. This is because part of the prophecy that foretold the eclipse also mentions the Falcon becoming the master of the sinful black sheep and the king of the blind white sheep. Apostles know their leader's goal is to unify both worlds under his personal rule, so if they had the chance to bring over future subjects for Griffith, they would have. With the amount of territory that Ganishka already had under him, the Falcon's dream would be halfway done without even having to lift a finger. Moreover, whoever he fought in the future would have to deal with the fact that Griffith had a sentient thundercloud under his control. The Falcon's war demons were formidable, and there were too many of them to ignore, but Ganishka alone had Griffith's aerial unit reeling, and if he was to go up against any other army, human or otherwise, they wouldn't stand a chance against him. His fog form's versatility would make him just what Griffith needed to keep his war demon's true nature concealed, because they can't go up against every enemy in their base forms. If they're cloaked in a fog so thick that people can't make out their shapes, Griffith never has to explain to his human subjects why they're fighting alongside demons. It preserves his image and also gives him an immense advantage on the field of battle. Sonya can help Griffith come up with and execute the perfect strategy in any given scenario because of her heightened Ode perception. She doesn't physically participate in conflict because even she knows that by herself she's of little use. But Ganishka can not only fight, he can also do Sonya's job for Griffith while destroying his enemies. His fog doubles as a radar, as you guys already know, and he can also make it work pretty much however he wishes. Griffith could implant a little bit of his fog into each war demon's body to keep a precise count of where they were going and how many were returning. And all of this isn't even mentioning the involvement of Ganishka's wizard general Daiba. The Dread Emperor was strong and cunning enough to take over a large chunk of the world even before he turned him into an apostle, but his expansion became insanely rapid after the fact. The main reason behind that was him enlisting Daiba into his army and giving him command over a unit of sorcerers. The Paramarishi Senani created the Pishacha core, tamed a creature as powerful as the Kundalini, and reconstructed the Behelit using the bodies of living apostles that had been stitched together. With his knowledge and Ganishka's powers, Griffith's already overwhelming military advantages would become insurmountable. However, an alliance between the two brings up a rather important question. Who will replace Ganishka as the catalyst for the Great Roar of the astral world? When you look at everything that happens during the Millennium Falcon arc from a bird's eye view, you come to realize that the whole conflict between Ganishka and Griffith was engineered to cement the fact that the latter was the god of this world. To become a hero, you need a villain to slay, and the sadistic Kushan Emperor fit that role perfectly. The Falcon had known the outcome of this war since the very beginning, because he was a god hand, and predicting matters related to causality was in his blood. Griffith knew that Ganishka would eventually become the bridge between the physical and the astral worlds, so he needed to buy himself enough time for the latter to turn into Shiva. This is why he asks the Kushan Emperor to delay their final confrontation in chapter 283, despite knowing full well that he had him on the ropes. Griffith used a mix of his war demons and regular soldiers to cut a path through a Kushan battle line of over 200,000 troops. It was easy as a breezy on the coast, and then he used said coastal breeze to scatter Ganishka's released form to the wind. The Dread Emperor was on his knees, and he knew he'd been defeated, which is why he was surprised to hear Griffith call their situation a stalemate. The Falcon knew damn well that he'd won, but he wanted to set the stage for Shiva's arrival, so he pricked Ganishka's ego into doing what he did. But here's the thing, Emperor Ganishka wasn't the one who was fated to become Shiva. He was just the apostle that happened to fit the requirements. If you look at the wording of Griffith's rebuttal to Skull Knight in chapter 304, you'll notice he says, "one who is reincarnated twice." This vagueness might feel like a poetic device at first, but the thing is, the Kushan Emperor is the second apostle that the God Hand tried manipulating into reincarnating twice. The first was the Slug Count, all the way back in the Black Swordsman arc. So if Shiva was simply going to be any apostle that had been reincarnated twice, that made it easier for Griffith to sort of engineer things in accordance with his plans. Ganishka didn't have to become Shiva. If they formed an alliance, Griffith could have had any one of his apostles descend into the man-made Behelit, or use Daiba's knowledge of the astral world to force one of them into it. He wouldn't even have to start a war with someone else to do this, obviously, like coming up with a reason to fight the Tudor Empire for the right to see who really ruled the Holy See or something like that. But once that conflict began, Griffith could plant this second reincarnate of his into their camp and have it be the Beast of the End instead. There are many ways in which the God Hand could have approached the fulfillment of the Great Roar, and Ganishka didn't have to be the one to take the fall. He just happened to be that guy. Once Fantasia took hold of the world, Griffith could use Ganishka's help to keep himself in power and establish his worldwide network of castles and pathways linking back to Falconia much quicker than his original plans from chapter 358. He would have no shortage of new evils to take care of and further his personal propaganda that positions him as the savior of the world. Ever since the Great Roar, creatures like the sea god that Guts and his friends defeated have cropped up all over the place. Considering the fact that this guy had the length and girth of Shiva itself, it wouldn't take much to convince the people that they needed to kill it to stay safe, or some other contradictory crap that Griffith's subjects would keep buying into. And with the Kushan and the Holy See on his side, the Falcon would also marginalize his only opposition in the world, Guts. It's thanks to Ganishka's demise that the Black Swordsman has allies in the form of the rest of the Kushan Empire today. Guys like Salat and Daiba, who worked under the Dread Emperor, are going to work with him to kill the man that threatens to take everything from them. But if Ganishka pledged his allegiance to Griffith, then that would leave Guts and his crew stranded from the world politically and militarily. Not to mention, they'd likely have no place to go after the destruction of Elfhelm, which is fated to occur anyways because of the inherent threat it poses to Griffith's authority. So yes, Ganishka joining up with Griffith would make his life a hell of a lot easier than it already is. But alas, that prospect is just a what-if episode at this point. The only way the Dread Emperor was going to contribute to another man's world conquest was with his corpse. And the irony of that statement is that, in a way, that's what happens. In the final moments of his life, the mindless Shiva Ganishka accepts Femto's light and allows it to embrace him as he passes away. His corpse transforms into the world spiral tree and becomes the energy source of the global interstice. The branches of Ganishka's dead body represent the different paths of the astral world, and Griffith and his armies have used them to their advantage many times already. So in a way, Ganishka did end up joining Griffith, just not how any of us expected. And trust us when we say that's for the best. Marvelous verdict! But you know what's the worst? The fact we have to let you guys go because that's all we got for this video. Emperor Ganishka and Griffith's war to see who the better world conqueror was the heartbeat of the most pivotal arc in Berserk. It could have played out so differently if one of them had simply shut his mouth and known his role, but that's Berserk, baby. Miura-sensei hated making things convenient for his characters, even if they were meant to be manifestations of God, and even if we have to admit that Griffith and Ganishka together would have made the bad guys way too overpowered. But what-ifs are meant for discussion, so what do you guys think about this one? How would things have played out if they joined forces instead of fighting one another? Tell us about your theories or anything we missed. Let us know about them in the comments down below, and remember, always keep struggling, strugglers.